China's rapid growth over the past 3 decades has been absolutely remarkable. They have lifted a population out of poverty and managed to grow into an economic powerhouse that now threatens to end an era of US world dominance and shift of a multipolar world. China's exploding growth has eaten away at the GDP gap between them and the US economy, putting China on the verge of becoming the world's largest economy. The rise of China is astonishing, but will it continue? In this video, we'll discuss the 3 reasons why this decade could be a potentially tumultuous decade for the Chinese economy, starting with the housing crisis. The dominoes began to fall in 2021 when Evergrande, China's second largest developer, began defaulting on debt payments. Following this, several other prominent Chinese developers followed suit. And a year later, in 2022, the consumers are starting to feel the pain. As is typical in China, consumers purchase properties as they're being developed. But as we've seen some of these major developers not able to pay their debts, some of the projects have halted, leaving consumers to pay a mortgage for a property that has yet to be delivered. In response, people began refusing to make payments for their mortgage and started protesting. These mortgage strikes started in Chengzhou and have since spread to over 100 Chinese cities. But what was the cause of all this? Well, there's 2 reasons: overdeveloping and overleveraging. Through several decades of rapid economic growth, China saw a mass migration from rural areas to urban areas. In response, China began developing like crazy to accommodate the shift of population centers. And then property prices started to boom, and people saw rapid appreciation on their properties and wanted more. People began speculating and buying more and more properties that they didn't intend to live or even rent out, and this just led to more development. It's estimated during its peak, China developed enough properties per month to house the population of Houston. China eventually overdeveloped their real estate, and as a result today, there are many ghost cities of empty apartment blocks across China. It's estimated that these empty apartments could house 90 million people. The bubble started building through this overdevelopment. But then add on top of that, many of these property developers became over-leveraged. In response, in 2019, the Chinese government implemented a 3-line policy to prevent these developers from taking on too much debt. But despite these restrictions, it's still estimated that 14 of China's 30 largest developers are in violation of this policy. So now, combining this overdevelopment with this over-leveraging, we're now starting to see the dominoes fall. Now, shifting over to the broad Chinese economy, it's estimated that 25 to 30% of Chinese GDP is related to real estate or construction, so there's potential for huge impact on the overall Chinese economy. And some fear that this could trickle over to the banking industry, as banks have $9.2 trillion worth of exposure to the Chinese real estate market. And couple this with the low reserve requirements in China, just fueling a debt environment that could lead to a run on the banks. We've already seen several local banks in the Henan province run out of money. And that leads to the major questions: what will the CCP's response be? At this point, it's mostly unknown, as they've just tried to bide their time while shifting blame to the local and state level governments. One option is to bail out the developers, and this would inject cash to allow the developers to finish these projects, and then people will be able to move in and resume paying their mortgages. However, that would cause the issue of moral hazard, because part of the reason we're seeing some of these problems is because of the irresponsibilities of these developers in the first place. Furthermore, the injection of cash that would be needed would cause huge inflationary pressures on the Chinese economy. And as China is trying to position the renminbi as a world reserve currency to compete with the dollar, that would just hurt that prospect. And another potential problem is, as real estate loses value, people may not be able to afford to make payments on their second or third residences, leading to potential foreclosures. In conclusion, bubble is an appropriate word to describe the Chinese real estate market. Considering how many people and how much of the Chinese economy is tied to real estate, it's conceivable to think that this could be comparable to the 2008 financial crisis, or perhaps even worse. Nevertheless, China is still a major producer and manufacturer with a strong labor force. This means that the Chinese economy will be viable for a long time, but at some point they will have to endure this bubble bursting, which could bring years of pain. This is 2 parts. first natural and second self-imposed. The first part of this is less concerning. Slowing growth is the natural progression of an emerging economy. A developed economy should grow around 2 to 3% in a normal year. However, this slowing economic growth is a sign that China is leaving the emerging stage and becoming closer to maturity, which means that the Chinese economy is likely to see smaller growth rates moving forward. So instead of the 7 to 8% growth rates we've seen in the past, maybe we're more likely to see 4 to 5% growth rates. And fundamentally, this is fine, but what is more concerning is the other reasons why we're seeing slowed growth. China's zero COVID policy is absolutely brutal to economic growth. The CCP has taken a stance of eradicating COVID in China. Well, most of the world is accepting the endemic nature of COVID and learning to live with the disease. China is still hell-bent on strict lockdowns. For example, China shut down Shanghai for more than a month, and recently we saw similar things in Wuhan. And China's COVID policy is impacting the accessibility on Chinese highways and causing inefficiencies at ports. This is one of the major reasons why we've seen so many global shortages. And this is also negatively impacting China's GDP. The good thing is that Xi Jinping could change this policy overnight with a change of heart. However, the bad thing is that he's backed himself into a corner, taking such a drastic stance that reversing this policy could hurt his image. And another reason we're seeing slowed growth in China is due to an aging population. In part, this is due to increases in technology, greater access to healthcare, and better standards, so people are living longer. But this is also due to China's one-child policy. China saw a huge population boom during the Great Leap Forward, where the government incentivized people to have lots of babies. However, by the early 70s, fears of overpopulation came to the surface, which led to the one-child policy, which ultimately decreased birth rates for decades. It's estimated that China would have 450 million more people if it wasn't for this policy, and that's on the conservative end. When you compare China to its geopolitical rival, India, you can see that China has a much older population. And the impact this policy has had on the economy has decreased the size of the potential labor force. And as the generation from the Great Leap Forward begins to retire, we may see a shrinking workforce in China. Now shifting over to our third issue. One area of concern is growing tensions between the United States and China, which could lead to less trade and cooperation between the two nations. There are a number of sensitive issues on the table that could potentially sour the relationship between these two economic leaders. Just pick one. And furthermore, we saw the Trump administration impose high tariffs on China, sparking fears of a trade war. But of all the issues, war with Taiwan seems the most likely, as Xi Jinping has stated previously that reunification must be fulfilled. And many people fear that he will want to do this under his reign as leader of the CCP, but doing so could be extremely costly to the Chinese economy. First, by doing so, they would likely alienate themselves from the West, and they could be hit by heavy sanctions similar to those that were imposed on Russia. The only difference is though, with China, the West would be mutually devastated to lose China as a trading partner. Both the EU and the US import over 20% of their total imports from China, making China the #1 importer to both these economies. However, an advantage that the West may have is they could look to replace these Chinese goods from some of China's competitors in the region. However, this would only be somewhat effective, as no one can manufacture and produce at scale and cost like China can. And shifting the conversation from sanctions to tactics, invading Taiwan would be extremely difficult, militarily speaking. There would be a high price for China to pay in terms of both money and lives, which would be extremely harmful to the Chinese economy. And especially if Taiwan was to receive military support from the US and Japan, this would make the mission even more difficult. An invasion for Taiwan would not only be detrimental to the Chinese economy, but the entire world. However, over time, Chinese control of Taiwan would be beneficial decades down the road, as Taiwan is a hotbed for technology, specifically semiconductors. And this would also give China a geographic advantage in control over the Pacific and surrounding areas like the South China Sea. In conclusion, one day I believe that China's economy will surpass the United States. To me, I feel this is inevitable. However, based on what's going on right now, I don't feel that this will happen anytime soon. And to determine when exactly this could happen would take extensive economic modeling way beyond my level of understanding. And that could all be thrown awry by multiple different variables. But to break it down, in general, yes, the Chinese economy is slowing as they enter the more developed stage, so the ground that they can close against the US is decreasing over time. But their population advantage and their growing capabilities is just too much to offset in the long run. In my opinion, the only way that China does not become the world's largest economy one day is if they take decades to overtake the US, and by that time, India surpasses them both. However, I think it's important that these two countries work together to prevent conflict at all costs. Ultimately, the US and China make each other stronger as partners, but as foes, they are both significantly weakened.